Hi, I'm Linda Markowski, and I'll be your host for this webcast. Today we're going to be talking about providing accessible customer service in businesses like yours and in organizations across Ontario. Accessible customer service is part of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA. It allows the province to develop accessibility standards that will remove barriers for people with disabilities and different abilities, making the province accessible by 2025. This is legislation that will open up your business to more customers, benefit all of us, and make Ontario's communities stronger. As a first step, all businesses in Ontario with at least one employee must offer accessible customer service by January 1st, 2012. The good news is it's easier than you might think. To start off, I want to show you what we heard when we asked some people, what does disability mean to you? Let's watch.
I've never tried to define disability for myself. It's one of those things that you know about its existence. You see individuals that have challenges, but on a day-to-day basis, you don't really think about it as part of your life until it becomes part of your reality.
I like to put ability instead of disability. I like to say, okay, I'm disabled, but with lots of abilities.
All disabilities, people with disabilities, have challenges because they either have a physical or a mental function which isn't working just the way everybody else's works.
Do you know what a disability is?
My impression of a disability is someone who may just need a bit more time or assistance.
In my view, a disability is an artificially created circumstance. I'm totally blind, and yet for most of the time, I'm not disabled. For example, when I'm sitting in a restaurant and somebody hands me a print menu, which is usually what I get, I instantly become disabled. Some restaurants now carry a Braille menu. I'm no longer disabled.
It's easy for me to go to school, to run up the stairs, to go down the hallway, to buy a coffee, all those little things. And for someone with a disability, it's so much more than that.
A disability is only a detour to where you want to get to.
And it doesn't necessarily mean somebody in a wheelchair. It could be intellectual, it could be vision, it could be hearing.
Invisible or visible, sensory, mobility, intellectual, or mental health. That would be my definition of disability.
We're not talking about disabilities. We're talking about people with disabilities. So it's the person we're talking about.
I actually have never stopped myself since my disability of not going to a store, women's clothing or a restaurant just because they have a step, because I feel that I want them to see me, how I had to get in there, because I obviously had to get help to just bump me up that one step.
So, as you heard from our guests in the studio, there are different types of disabilities, visible and invisible or hidden. Here are some types of disabilities: vision, hearing, physical, intellectual, developmental, learning, mental health, speech or language, or deaf-blind. It's also important to note that we're talking about disabilities that people may have for a short time, a long time, or for their whole lives. Offering accessible customer service is not about the structure of your physical premises, not about changing doors or adding elevators or ramps. It's simply about understanding that customers with disabilities may have different needs, and helping them can be as easy as asking one simple question: how can I help? So, you might be wondering, where did this come from? What are barriers? Does this affect my business? What do I need to do? How do I get started? Who can I talk to if I have questions? We're going to answer all these questions, provide you with lots of useful examples, and point you to some free online tools. First, let's start with some background so you can understand where accessible customer service came from. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act 2005, or AODA, became law on June the 13th, 2005. The purpose of this landmark legislation is to benefit all people in Ontario by developing mandatory accessibility standards that will identify, remove, and prevent barriers for people with disabilities in key areas of daily living. The standards were developed through an inclusive, consensus-based approach by involving people with disabilities, representatives of business, industries, and the nonprofit sector, municipalities, and other public sector organizations. These standards will be implemented in stages phased in over time. We are being realistic and allowing organizations flexibility to meet the requirements because we want accessibility to succeed. Accessibility standards have been completed or are being developed in the following key areas: customer service, employment, information and communications, transportation, built environment. The Accessible Customer Service Standard was the first to be completed, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Standards for employment, information and communication, and transportation are next, and they are being integrated into one regulation to make it easier for businesses to comply. The Built Environment Standard is the last to be drafted, and the government is working to integrate it with the building code and the other accessibility standards. To be clear, only the standard for accessible customer service is complete. These other standards are all being developed. Once the other standards are final, we'll let you know and help you with tools and information so you can be prepared to comply with these standards. Now let's talk a bit about barriers. The standards being developed will remove barriers for people with disabilities and different abilities. We often think of a barrier as something we can see, like stairs. But barriers, like disabilities, can also be invisible, such as attitudes and stereotypes. When you think about making your organization accessible, it is important to be alert to both visible and hidden barriers. Let's go back to our friends in the studio and ask them what it means to remove barriers.
So what makes a person's life inclusive?
Well, I've always known that the greatest barrier that people who are blind or others that are labeled as disabled face is not the physical inability, it's the attitude and perception of individuals, others, and society, but perhaps equally as important, the attitude and perception that we have of ourselves.
My life changed in an instant. You know, I was injured in a motor vehicle accident 17 years ago. And I think all my family and friends just did not know how to approach me, actually, and how to sort of handle it. And I think that what I found is that I was the one that was able to make them feel comfortable around me by sort of talking about myself.
So to make an accessible world for people, we have to start looking at communication.
I think it's usually the first few seconds is what it will take for the two people to be comfortable with each other. And then it's great from there.
A lot of people feel that because I'm visually impaired that I can read Braille. And I don't read Braille. I need somebody to read the menu for me. And I would like them to ask me what I would like. I don't want them to ask somebody sitting next to me because I know what I like and what I don't like.
A lot of people have this notion that since you can't see, it really doesn't matter if you have dark brown shoes or black shoes.
Often, when we take down a barrier for one person or help to take down a barrier for one person, we put up a barrier for another. Many times you'll hear people say, well, he's blind, but he may not be blind. He may be a person with a visual impairment. He has different needs. People who are deaf have different needs than people who have hearing impairments.
It's kind of absurd how little we know about people with disabilities in comparison to the rest of the cultures and the rest of the different groups of people that we live amongst.
The first thing you have to do is look at yourself. That's where education starts. Government can tell you, other people can tell you, books can tell you. But until you sort of look at yourself and look at someone you know who has a disability, that's how you educate yourself.
If a person doesn't understand the disability, then they don't know maybe how to socially interact with the person with the disability.
All Ontarians believe in accessibility, and they believe it's the right thing to do. Accessibility is about social inclusion. For the world to be accessible, everybody has to be able to participate.
A fully accessible society is important for everyone. It will allow many of us to enjoy a quality of life that most others take for granted.
It's about you and I and people who have disabilities being able to do the same things.
So, a barrier is anything that keeps someone with a disability from working, playing, shopping, studying, or getting around in our communities. Architectural or structural barriers may result from the design of a building, such as stairs, heavy doors, or narrow doorways, the width of hallways, and even room layout. Information and communications barriers, including technology, can make it difficult for people to receive or convey information. Things like small print size, confusing design of printed materials, and the use of language that is not clear or plain can all cause difficulty. Everyday tools like computers and telephones can present barriers, but they can also remove them. Attitude is perhaps the most difficult barrier to overcome. Some people worry that they could offend the individual with a disability by offering help, so they ignore or avoid people with disabilities altogether. Others may discriminate because of stereotypes. Systemic barriers can occur when attitudes are embedded in policies and procedures. These are any practices or rules that restrict people with disabilities. For example, a no refund policy in a retail clothing store. People in wheelchairs or scooters or people with anxiety disorders frequently can't try things on in a change room, so they must take the clothes home to try them on. But if they don't fit and the store has a strict no refund policy, they can't return them. To recap, a barrier keeps people from living their full life, from going to work, from play, and from participating in their community. There are 4 types of barriers: architectural or structural, information and communications, including technology, attitude, and systemic. Today we're going to focus on how to provide customer service in a way that removes or doesn't create barriers for someone with a disability. To learn more about the current status of the other standards and how to recognize and remove barriers, visit our website, ontario.ca/accesson. We've talked about where the standards came from and what they are intended to do. Now let's look at who has to provide accessible customer service. The accessibility standards for customer service affect companies or organizations that provide goods or services either directly to the public or to other businesses or organizations, and have 1 or more employees in Ontario. When we say 1 employee, that doesn't just mean full-time staff. Even if you just hire 1 person for the summer, you're included under the standard. Manufacturers, wholesalers, and construction companies are required to provide accessible service, even though they may not think of their clients as customers. In fact, customers can include other businesses and organizations, governments, or a very specific client group that you may serve, like healthcare providers. Not-for-profit organizations, such as places of worship, community centers, and outreach organizations are also included under this standard. And public sector organizations are required to meet the requirements of the standard as well. Examples of these types of organizations include municipalities, universities and colleges, hospitals, and school boards. If you're not sure if your organization is affected, ask us. You can call us at the numbers on the screen. Next, let's talk about exactly what the standard requires you to do. Providing accessible customer service is easier than you might think. Let's look at some examples.
As a business, first of all, you have to have policies and practices in place that recognize that you're taking accessibility serious and that you're participating in breaking down barriers for people. It means that you have to make your staff aware and that your staff have to be trained in how to serve people with disabilities and to have an awareness of what of various disabilities.
There's so many different aspects in running a retail store, and I think the first and most important aspect is customer service. And so it starts with myself, being the owner of the store, that when I'm on the retail floor, that I ask customers how they're doing and if they're finding everything they need. And it's important that our managers do the same thing and our floor staff do the same thing. So it carries right through the whole organization.
Our designers wanted to hear firsthand from the customer. They wanted to understand, what does it really take to make an exhibit more accessible for someone who's blind or someone who's deaf or a person who has autism, for example.
Right.
So we put together a committee of 10 people, and all of these different disabilities are represented.
I think a lot of people with disabilities want to feel independent and want to shop in a store that treats them like everyone else.
I mean, we try not to treat the person differently. We certainly have to treat your situation differently and make sure that we can accommodate you.
The accessibility in a store will influence a lot my family directly.
It's the utmost importance to have complete accessibility, and it goes along with independence.
Mais un bon service à la clientèle, ça c'est de l'or, ça c'est précieux. Et ça va tellement avoir un grand impact sur moi que je vais retourner à ce magasin-là, mais sans aucun problème, j'y serai fidèle.
I believe that somebody that's providing customer service needs to ask the right questions. They need to ask questions. They can't make assumptions, and they have to be an active listener.
And if each person reaches out and does one little thing, we're saying customer service here. I don't like customer service. I like to say people helping people.
Astra, how can I help you as a retail owner?
Good service, friendly conversation keeps me coming back to the same store.
We've developed a compliance manual specifically for small business that has lots of practical examples and tips. It also provides more detail on the requirements that I'm going to go through now. There are only 10 requirements that all organizations across Ontario with one employee or more must meet. The first requirement of the Accessible Customer Service Standard is to develop customer service policies and procedures for serving people with disabilities. This isn't as complicated as it sounds. Start by listing what you do now to serve your customers or clients. This can include informal practices and procedures where you use only verbal instructions, as well as formal written policies and procedures. Next, identify any gaps. Given what you do now, what things need to change so that people with disabilities will have equal access to your goods or services? Finally, develop your new or revised policies, practices, and procedures using reasonable efforts to ensure that they are consistent. Let's look at some examples. That clothing store that I mentioned earlier with the no refunds policy might revise their policy to include exceptions for customers with disabilities because its fitting rooms are not wheelchair accessible. A coffee shop that has a customer with a mental health disability who finds it difficult to be around crowds might offer the customer a quiet table away from the busy section of the shop. This allows the customer equal opportunity to enjoy his food and drink. To help you develop policies and procedures for your organization, there is an accessibility policy template on our website. When developing these policies, it's often helpful to include your staff in the process, particularly those who deal with customers most often. Let's move on to the next requirement. Make sure that the policies and procedures you develop are consistent with the principles of independence, dignity, integration, and equality of opportunity. Let me give you a for instance to illustrate this one. Imagine you are organizing a meeting in a small boardroom. You've invited 12 of your customers, but it's a tight fit with little room between the chairs and walls. The first customer to arrive uses a walker, the next uses a cane. After they are seated, you become concerned that others entering the room may trip on the assistive devices, possibly injuring themselves or damaging the walker or cane. So you say, I'm just going to take your walker and cane and put them over in the corner so they won't break if someone steps on them. While your concern is well-meaning, this practice is not consistent with the principles of independence, dignity, integration, and equality of opportunity, because the participants might not be able to choose to leave the meeting, change their seats, stand to make a point, without asking you to return their assistive devices. There are other examples and more information about the principles of independence, dignity, integration, and equality of opportunity available to help you understand this requirement in the online manual I mentioned earlier that you can find under the Tools to Help You Comply section at ontario.ca/access on. The third requirement, have a policy on allowing people to use their own assistive devices. These are things like canes, wheelchairs, oxygen tanks, to access your goods and services. Your policy might be very general or may need to be more specific based on your business. Let's look at another example. Some people with low vision use magnification devices called monoculars to see large screens or other things at a distance. At a movie theater that prohibits recording devices, a staff person might assume the monocular is a recording device and restrict a person from using one. Having a policy on the use of assistive devices could address this. The next requirement is about communication. The Accessible Customer Service Standards require that you or your staff communicate with a person with a disability in a manner that takes into account his or her disability. For instance, a gym offers their group exercise class schedule in paper format at the front desk. When a customer with low vision asks for the schedule in Braille, the manager explains that it is not available in Braille, but is available in an accessible format on the company website. This works for the customer because she has a screen reader at home that reads what is displayed on the website. The manager could also ask if there are specific classes that the customer is interested in and offer to read her the information on those. You can get some other ideas on how to communicate with people with different disabilities by visiting our website. Communication is the key to good customer service, and it all starts with asking a simple question: how can I help? We'll go back to the studio a little later to get people's reactions to that question, but first let's finish off the requirements. The fifth requirement is that you allow people with disabilities to be accompanied by their service animal, such as a guide dog or hearing dog, in areas of your business that are open to the public. The only exception here would be areas of your business where animals are prohibited by law. For example, the kitchen of a restaurant. If service animals are excluded by law, your policy will need to identify other ways for people with service animals to access your goods or services. Perhaps you can go to their premises or provide your services over the internet or over the phone. When we talk about service animals, we often get questions about allergies. If your staff or other customers are allergic to animals, talk to all those involved to find a way to accommodate everyone's needs on the premises, or provide your services over the internet or over the phone. Talking about this with your staff and making sure they are trained and understand their responsibilities in advance makes all the difference. We'll talk more about training shortly. The sixth requirement is that you permit people with disabilities who rely on a support person to bring that person with them while accessing your goods or services. For example, a person with a disability goes to meet with her financial advisor, accompanied by her support person. Before they start discussing specific financial details, the advisor simply asks the person with a disability for her consent to have the conversation while the support person is in the room. The next requirement is related and indicates that where admission fees are charged, you must post information about your policy regarding what fee, if any, would be charged for a support person accompanying a person with a disability. For example, a dinner theater posts a notice on its website and at its ticket window, stating that support persons will not be charged if they are not consuming food during the show. The notice states that support persons will be charged half of the usual price if they wish to eat the meal provided. That's specific and clear. The 8th requirement says that if you offer facilities or services for people with disabilities, such as an elevator or accessible washroom, let people know when they are out of order. For example, a dry cleaning business that needs to remove the ramp in front of their store for a few weeks for repairs posts a sign outside and leaves a message on their voicemail explaining the situation. Both the sign and the message explain that repairs are being done, give the date when the ramp will be available again, and offer to meet the customers outside if they call ahead in order to pick up or drop off garments. But it's not just about ramps or elevators. An art gallery has recorded audio tours for people with vision loss, but isn't able to offer these tours for a 2-week period because the equipment is being upgraded. When this happens, notices are posted on the gallery's accessible website ahead of time. Staff also inform visitors as they enter the gallery that recorded audio tours are not available, but that staff would be willing to provide a guided tour instead. The 9th requirement is that you train your staff, volunteers, and contractors to serve customers with disabilities. You also need to train the people in your organization who develop customer service policies, practices, and procedures. This may be your managers, your board, and/or your human resource staff. Again, please visit ontario.ca/accesson for free downloadable training manuals and an online course called Servability that covers most of what your staff need to know. The 10th requirement is that you let customers with disabilities and different abilities provide feedback on how you met their needs and establish a process to respond and take action on any complaints. A hotel invites its guests to provide feedback by posting a sign in the lobby and including a notice on the bill. Front desk staff also mention that feedback is appreciated and can be submitted in person, by phone, or on the company website. Remember, it's not just customers with disabilities who can provide feedback on how accessible your customer service is. It's anyone. If you have 20 or more employees, you must complete 4 additional requirements. First, complete an online report on your compliance by the reporting deadline. This is a short online checklist report. You will be sent instructions on how to access and complete this report closer to the reporting deadline of 2012. Second, if you have 20 or more employees, you must also document in writing all of your policies and procedures on how you met each of the requirements. For example, if you hold a group training session for your employees, have each employee sign in, have a person with authority in the organization certify that each of the participants stayed for the duration of the session, indicate the date of the session, the length of the training, the location, the trainer, and the method used. Third, you must notify customers that all of the documents required by the standard are available upon request. This should be done in a number of ways. For example, post a notice in 1 or more places where customers will notice it. Put it on your website, tell them in person, and include it on your phone message. The final requirement for organizations with 20 or more employees indicates that when you are providing documents required under the standard, you need to make sure the information is in a format that takes into account the person's disability. To recap, the Accessible Customer Service Standard requires that you develop policies for serving people with disabilities, Make sure those policies adhere to principles of independence, dignity, integration, and equality of opportunity. Allow assistive devices. Consider a person's disability when you communicate with them. Remember, it starts with asking, "How can I help?" Allow service animals. Welcome support persons. Post information about fees for support persons. Let people know when accessible services aren't available. Train your staff, managers with responsibility for policies, practices, and procedures, volunteers, and contractors, and invite customers to provide feedback. If you have 20 or more employees, there are additional requirements for online reporting and informing the public about how you provide accessible customer service. Most of you are probably thinking that some of these requirements are just business as usual for you, and that's great. For those requirements that are new to the way you do business, we have tools to help you meet the requirements of the standard. Let's go back to the studio one more time and ask them to sum it up.
Persons with disabilities spend annually in Canada $25 billion. So it only makes sense that if you're in business, that you look towards that sector to improve your business opportunities.
And what does it end up costing me? I'll tell you, nothing. Very, very minimal. And what do I get in return? In the last 3 or 4 years, we've built 6 homes with varying degrees of accessible features in them. 6 sales that I would never have gotten if I hadn't even reached out and tried to make those accommodations.
So it's about incremental steps, and it's about small changes.
How can I help? Those are 4 great words. I had to count them up. How can I help? 4 great words, because they apply to anything.
You know, that's a very warm and engaging thing to say to someone with a disability. How can I help you?
Often we're afraid to ask because we think we're going to offend, but sometimes the easiest way to learn is to actually ask the person about themselves and how can I help you to participate with me in whatever we're doing.
We all have to help each other.
By saying,
How can I help?
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 How can I help? If everyone in your company asks that one simple question, you're well on your way to providing accessible customer service. As you start to meet the requirements to make your business more accessible, you may have questions. We have tools, templates, and lots of information to help you better understand and meet the requirements of the standard. Just visit our website, give us a call, or write to us. Thanks for watching, and thanks for your commitment to accessibility.